Chapter 131. Yes, Rinchanshan nodded, then immediately asked, "When can I start learning swordsmanship?" Li Hao glanced at her and said, "They'll teach you one sword technique first, reflect on it slowly, understand it slowly. If you don't understand, then ask, 'Okay.'" Rinchanshan's face lit up with joy, and then, seeing that Li Hao had no sword by his side, she quickly offered her own sword. "You can use mine." No need. Li Hao turned around and picked up the brush that was resting on the inkstone table next to him. He then casually released a stream of sword chi. The sword chi skimmed over the surface of the pond and the water parted on its own. The slash as clean as a severed waterfall. For a good few moments, the parted space only slowly healed, and where the sword chi had passed the end of the pond, it caused no disturbances, not harming even a single blade of grass or tree. Li Yuanzhao and Rinchanshan both stood there stunned. Rooted to the spot, they could muster sword chi as well, but to flick it forth as easily as Li Hao did was something they did not even dare to dream of. Especially since this sword chi actually vanished without a trace. This effortless control left them dumbstruck. Brother Hao. Li Yuanzhao came back to his senses and hurriedly said, "Brother Hao, I want to learn too. The sword manual from Listening Rain Tower? Go flip through it yourself." Li Hao glanced at him and said, "Come ask me when you don't understand." "Okay." Upon hearing this, Li Yuanzu's face broke into a joyful smile, and after bidding farewell to Li Hao, he scampered off, yet Rinchanshan was still staring at the edge of the pond. Lost in a slight daze. Time flew by. In the following days, Li Hao continued to read in Listening Rain Tower, occasionally lost in thought in the courtyard. As for Rinchanshan, Li Hao was not in a rush to teach her the swordsmanship of Listening Rain Tower, instead, letting her practice with a sword in the courtyard. By herself, he would occasionally give pointers, identifying flaws in her swordsmanship, helping her gradually perfect her technique, moving towards an ultimate level of mastery. In the courtyard, Li Hao stood with his hands behind his back, looking at a withered, yellow, bare tree. Bien Rushua walked over, and on the other side of the tree, she saw a young girl practicing with a sword, which caused a brief flicker in her eyes. She had heard these past few days that the girl was Li Hao's sword attendant, the daughter of a grandmaster. However, even with the noble identity of a grandmaster's daughter, that was nothing rare in the divine general mansion. Bien Rushua could tell that the girl's swordsmanship was quite exquisite, but it still paled in comparison to her own. Thus, she didn't pay much more attention. After all, there were thousands of swordsmen in the world, with no small number who were masters of their craft. "Brother Hao, what are you looking at?" Seeing Li Hao gazing at a withered tree, Bien Rushua couldn't help but ask. The last vestige of autumn on the tree had already withered away. Li Hao's gaze sharpened as he said softly, "I am watching the wind." "The wind?" Bien Rushua looked around. There was wind in the world, but it could only be felt, so how could one see it? "It's a shame the wind is too light," Li Hao said with a smile so light that it cannot lift the tangled fallen leaves, let alone shake this tree. Bien Rushua paused for a moment, looking towards the barren tree. Indeed, she could feel the breeze against her face, which in the leafy sprout of spring would have revealed the wind's form as it swayed. But the season was now deep autumn. Suddenly, a thudding noise came from the ground. Immediately after, a multitude of horse hooves sounded from far to near, galloping past the courtyard outside. Bien Rushua was surprised. Riding horses within the mansion was not unusual, but who would ride in groups so recklessly and at such high speeds? Her divine soul flew out of her body, and from midair, she saw a group of figures wearing kasayas passing by on the road outside the mountain and river courtyard, heading towards a distant direction. That place was Shueihua Courtyard, and the leader of the group was a middle-aged man draped in clean robes, with the solemn appearance of a bodhisattva. Aside from practicing swordsmanship in Jianlu, Bien Rushua, under the tutelage of other senior brothers, had learned about the renowned forces of the world, knowledge that would be useful when she eventually joined society. Understanding human relations and recognizing people and paths were even more important than swords and sabers in Jianghu, and these people in front of her were from Mount Wuliang. The leader was dressed in the attire of a bodhisattva from Mount Wuliang. Bodhisattvas are powerful beings of the four stands realm, only second to the infinite Buddha Lord, who has been revered for 1,000 years. Bien Rukshu's expression changed slightly, and she soon noticed at the bodhisattva's side a young figure riding shoulder to shoulder with him. The figure passed by hurriedly, but at that moment, he suddenly turned his head and looked towards Bien Rukshu's divine soul. Their eyes meeting, Bien Rushue immediately knew that he was the son of her second aunt, the very true dragon competitor for Li Hao this time. Li Qianfeng. The horses were running fast, and the gaze was but a fleeting exchange. The youth had already turned back and rode away. Bien Ruxu's divine soul returned to her body, her face showing solemnity as she said to Li Hao, "Brother Hao, you must be careful of that person. Just now I felt that he is very extraordinary." That brief eye contact had given her a chilling sense of all her hairs standing on end. She felt that if the other party made a move, he could kill her in an instant. This inevitably caused her to worry about Li Hao. A smile appeared on Li Hao's face. The breeze blew past his feet, lifting only a fallen leaf which tumbled onto the top of his shoe, as time counted down. With the return of Li Qianfeng to the mansion, the days at the Divine General Mansion became increasingly lively every day. People came to visit, with most heading towards Shuihua Courtyard. These visitors were mostly relatives of the Lu family, naturally coming to support their nephew. On the third day before the deadline, Li Tiangang, accompanied by Li Xuanli, the ladies of each courtyard, went deep into Divine General Mansion to Wangyu Mountain, and led down the old lady who had been chanting and praying for 20 years. The old lady was none other than Li Tiangang's mother Chenhefeng. She was also Li Hao's paternal grandmother at the same time. The old lady was also a member of one of the 5 great Divine General Mansions. The Chun family, having married off to the Li family, she bore 9 sons whose names shook the world for the generations. True dragon of the Li family. It seemed, however, that the old lady had long since had little contact with the Chun family. The feuds and entanglements among the millennia-old Divine General Mansions were complex, not to mention the grudges within the mansion itself, and were not easily conveyed in a few words. As Chun Hafeng was brought out, everyone in the Divine General Mansion gathered in Green Lotus Courtyard, which had been cleaned and long unoccupied in the Grand Main Hall. Li Tiangang and other members of the second generation gathered to pay their respects, while Li Fenghua, the uncle guarding the frontier pass, also hurried back. This selection of the true dragon was a moment to be witnessed, unless one had absolutely no way to be excused there. Li Hao and Li Qianfeng encountered each other once again. For Li Qianfeng, this was his first time seeing Li Hao. As for when they were children, when Li Hao was brought to the courtyard by his mother, Li Qianfeng hardly paid any attention, and even if he did see him, it had long since been tossed to the back of his mind and not taken to heart. This was the son of his 7th uncle. He stood with his hands behind his back, tilting his head as he sized up Li Hao, squinting his eyes. As for Li Wushuang, who stood behind Li Hao and the rest of the 3rd generation of the Li family, he glanced over them as well, but found none who caught his eye. Li Wushuang, whom he had originally regarded as a rival, now under his scrutinizing gaze found to be only of the divine travel realm, not having stepped even 15 li into it. Even if it were a contest of power within the same realm, he was not afraid. Only this young man, whose fame was growing throughout Qingzhou and gradually spreading to other provinces, gave him a sense of depth that was immeasurable. He could not see through Li Hao's cultivation realm at all. Chapter 132. Are you Xiao Hao? Apart from Li Qianfeng, standing outside the hall among the 3rd generation were also the children of He Jianlan, Li Mingguang and Li Sibei. Both were around 35 years old now in terms of age. They were much older than Li Hao and the others, almost twice as much. Both had already joined the military early on and now held the rank of general in the army. With exceedingly high cultivation levels, Li Mingguang had just entered the 1st stage of the immortal, while his sister, Li Sibei, had entered the heavenly human realm many years ago. In terms of cultivation level, the two of them were the top among the 3rd generation of the Li family, unmatched by anyone. The same was true for their merits and contributions. After all, age was a factor, but He Jianlan had said early on that her children would not vie for a true dragon seat. These words were public, naturally carrying great binding force. However, even if they were to compete in the same age group, Li Mingguang had only entered the 15 li realm at 18 years old. He stepped into the heavenly human realm at 25 now. 10 years later, having entered the immortal realm, such progress was already extraordinary. However, compared to Li Qianfeng and Li Hao of the same age, they seemed somewhat inferior at this moment. Li Mingguang was smiling as he scrutinized Li Hao. He had heard of him even before returning to Qingzhou and had quite some expectations for this younger cousin, whom he had never met. Such astonishing talent had already surpassed that of his uncle from back in the day. He and his sister Li Sibei were born earlier and grew up together with the uncle, speaking of which, he was even somewhat older than the uncle. But still, seniority was seniority, and when he saw his uncle, 2 years his junior, He would obediently bow his head and respectfully and politely call out uncle. Aside from the Li family's strict rules, he did it willingly. After all, the uncle with whom he had played and cultivated as a child, once he stepped onto the path of cultivation, had left everyone in the dust each year. He would shock everyone in the courtyard. Like a brilliant shooting star, unfortunately, the heavens envy the gifted 14 years ago when the uncle passed away. He too had accompanied with a flask of liquor in the distant frontier military post. Drinking in the military was a big taboo, but he still drank. After finishing the drink, he voluntarily received his punishment and was awarded 100 military lashes. His skin split open and his flesh a blurry mess, yet he did not frown at all at the time and instead smiled. It was only later when he returned to his own camp that he wept inconsolably. Cousin Li Hao nodded in greeting to Li Mingguang. I can't even see through your cultivation level. You must have practiced a technique to conceal your aura, little rascal, Li Mingguang said with a smile. Li Hao smiled slightly. Li Mingguang then turned to look at Li Qianfeng next to him. Compared to Li Hao's breeze-like presence, Li Qianfeng was like a blade, half unsheathed though restrained. He already displayed a chilling sharpness, and his aura was even more profound and imposing, far surpassing any ordinary 15 Li realm. Seeing both his younger cousins doing so well, a look of relief surfaced in Li Mingguang's eyes. I've come back this time to see you vie for the true dragon position. Your eldest sister and I will not participate in terms of talent. We are no match for you. The future will depend on you. Li Qianfeng nodded slightly. Cousin? Rest assured. Li Hao looked at the other 2 times, thinking that his cousin's character was somewhat similar to his aunt's setting. Aside talent, the elder brother's demeanor he naturally carried, in Li Hao's view, was also somewhat suitable for taking on the role of family head. But while you compete for the position, do not hold grudges or harbored resentment secretly, said Li Sibei next to them. She, like her brother, had changed from armor into fine clothes, but after years of military service, she was still upright in posture and unlike ordinary women. Her brows were imbued with a certain heroic air. You're right, cousin, said Li Hao with a smile. Nodding, Li Qianfeng gave a slight nod, his expression serene. Seeing their reactions, Li Sibei smiled faintly, her gaze moving beyond them to Li Wushuang and the others, giving them all a slight nod in greeting, as it was not appropriate to say much outside the hall. She did not reminisce with each one. Before long, the elders in the hall finished paying respects to their grandmother and called in Li Hao and the rest of the 3rd generation of the Li family. Leading the way, Li Mingguang and the others followed suit, and upon entering the hall, they saw grandmother Chen Hafeng sitting at the upper end of the hall. The other elders and ladies of various courtyards were respectively seated on the 2 sides, while the concubines stood obediently behind the ladies. Li Mingguang, tall and broad, walked into the center of the hall and knelt down in respects. The rest followed closely, all kneeling to pay their respects. Please rise, Chen Hafeng said with a smile on her face. Everyone got up, and Li Hao looked up to observe his grandmother. Her hair was snow-white, combed neatly like silver threads. She looked old, with wrinkles on her skin, but no age spots, and her skin was rosy, making her appear to be a very clean old lady. Furthermore, although she was aged, one could see that she must have been very beautiful when she was young, and she still had beautiful features. While Li Hao was observing her, Chen Hafeng was also sizing up these grandchildren. She was most familiar with Li Mingguang. She had held him when he was a child, and he often came to play in the Green Lotus courtyard. Together with Junyi, however, after the eldest and the 3rd brother died in battle one after the other, followed by the death of the 9th and the 6th sons, her hair turned white overnight, and she handed over all the household affairs to her daughter-in-law, He Jianlin. She herself went to Wangyu Mountain to pray and fast, hoping to see the soul of the 9th son return soon. Thinking of the 6th and 9th sons, Chen Hafeng's eyes filled with sorrow. For years she had dreamed of them running towards her countless times at night, as joyous as when they were children, filled with vigor, calling out, "Mother, Mother." Those 2 children had lived too bitterly. One left behind only a single son, while the other had not yet married, without the chance to glimpse the pleasures of the world, buried early in the frontier wilderness. Mingguang, come here, let your grandmother have a look at you, said Chen Hafeng as she quickly composed her emotions and smiled. Li Mingguang, seeing his grandmother's white hair, had nothing but distress in his eyes. He stepped forward, bending his normally straight and tall spine. At the frontier pass, do not seek glory recklessly, for the Li family no longer lacks for accomplishments and honors. Chen Hafeng spoke softly as she caressed her eldest grandson's shoulders, whispering, Grandma only wishes for all of you to live well." As she spoke these words, tears welled up in the eyes of many ladies. Jiang Xiener, sitting at the end, had moist eyes as she turned her head slightly away. These young men are still here, but how many of the young men from those days have returned? Those spirited youths are the fathers of the children today. They are also their husbands. Li Mingguang's heart trembled, and he nodded firmly. "Your grandson will bear it in mind." Chen Hafang's gaze was gentle as she called Li Sibei over and scrutinized the former little girl who had now blossomed into a dashing figure, resembling her elder brother Li Xingbei around the brows and eyes. Chen Hafang liked what she saw more and more and couldn't help but sigh. Afterward, her gaze turned to the other grandchildren. Her eyes swept over their young, tender cheeks, which were already showing signs of distinction. There was a youthful aura about them. Although it was their first meeting, she could see many familiar reflections in them. "Which one is Hao heir?" Chen Hafang asked gently. Li Hao was slightly taken aback, took a small step forward. "I am. Greetings to Grandma." Chen Hafang looked him up and down and beckoned with a smile. "Come here and let Grandma have a look at you." Under the watchful eyes of everyone present, Li Hao obediently stepped forward, coming before Chen Hafang. Chen Hafang examined Li Hao carefully, then suddenly sighed lightly. "You look so much like your mother." Li Hao's gaze shifted slightly and he said nothing. "It's our first meeting, and Grandma doesn't have much to give you. But I heard you like to use the sword. I'll give you one," she said as Chen Hafang spoke. She called a servant by her side to bring over a sword box. Upon seeing the sword box, Li Tiangang couldn't help but stand up, saying, "Mother, this was the companion sword once used by Uncle Nine." Jiang Xiener's eyes narrowed slightly. "Exactly. It's the companion sword your Uncle Nine used. Eternal Night." Chen Hafang's hand gently stroked the sword box, her eyes full of affection as she looked at Li Hao. "This sword is one of the 10 famous swords in the world. I've heard you also wield a sword, so I'm giving it to you. Do not let its reputation be tarnished." Li Hao's heart jolted. A sword capable of killing great demons at the Four Stands realm was incredibly sharp, and the sword possessed an extremely special power, but it required a certain realm to unleash it. In his hands at the moment, its only abilities were to banish souls and expel evil, in addition to its sharpness. But that was enough. "Thank you, Grandma," Li Hao said as he accepted it, speaking softly. Though softly spoken, Chen Hafang could detect the gravity in the child's words and couldn't help but smile. The others remained silent. The sword box, stored away for so many years, had now been entrusted to Li Hao. It was clear how much the mother cherished this grandson she was meeting for the first time. But perhaps it was also because Chen Hafang saw the shadow of Li Junyi and Li Hao. Both were equally dazzling, shining brightly in the crowd. Li Qianfeng's expression darkened for a moment, but he said nothing. Lu Yurong had a smile on her face, though it seemed a bit forced, yet at that moment, everyone's attention was on Li Hao and the black sword box, and no one paid her any mind. After handing over the sword box to Li Hao, Chen Hafang called Li Qianfeng over as well. She said gently, "I heard you have been cultivating in Mount Wuliang. I have 3 treasured Buddhist scriptures here that I'll give to you." Li Qianfeng looked slightly awkward. A famous sword to Li Hao, and Buddhist scriptures to him? Still, he dared not show his discontent, and instead bowed his head. "Thank you," Grandma Chen Hafang said with a smile. "One of these scriptures contains a top-notch Buddhist cultivation technique. Great compassionate hand if you can master it. Not only will the technique itself be powerful, but it will also aid in your future cultivation of sword arts." Li Qianfeng was taken aback, then couldn't help showing his delight. "Thank you, Grandma." Chen Hafang waved her hand, telling him and Li Hao to step aside, then called over the other grandchildren, giving them various gifts in turn. While there were disparities, they weren't significant. After the meeting was over, everyone dispersed from the Green Lotus courtyard. However, Chen Hafang stopped He Jianlan and a few other ladies, seemingly to inquire about the internal affairs of the mansion over the years, and also asked Lu Yurong to notify the 4 standing realms bodhisattva who had descended from Mount Wuliang and was residing in the mansion to come for an audience. Time flies. Qingzhou City became increasingly lively after the elder lady came down from the mountain. Before long, the day for the True Dragon's decree arrived. Outside the entrance of the Divine General Mansion, the street was jam-packed, with countless carriages arriving, all belonging to dignitaries and nobles, including numerous civil and military officials who had come from all 19 provinces to extend their congratulations. Such a grand occasion had occurred once before a decade ago, and it was equally bustling now. The threshold of the divine general mansion was nearly worn down from all the foot traffic. The Liu family's relatives arrived one after another. The Liu family was also a prominent clan in the outer provinces, and with Liu Yurong married into the divine general mansion, the Liu family naturally leveraged the Li family's influence to grow even more rapidly, with their official ranks soaring in the court. Most of the Liu family were civil servants. Several of their ancestors were top scholars and were currently serving as officials in the court. Beyond the Liu family's relatives and numerous civil and military officials, other earls and marquises also paid visits to support Li Qianfeng and display their connections. In addition, individuals from the other 4 major divine general mansions came as well, but they were just making ordinary visits without siding with anyone. Seemingly just curious to see the kind of strength the Li family's true dragon possessed. The outside of the courtyard was noisy and bustling inside. However, Li Hao had moved an old armchair outdoors, comfortably basking in the sun. Before long, Bian Ruxue came running back into the courtyard, followed by a series of footsteps. Li Hao raised his eyebrows slightly and flipped open the book of poetry that shielded his face from the sun. Turning his head to look, to his surprise, he saw a familiar face, his hair and beard all white, his bearing as solid as a sword. The one walking in front of Bian Ruxue was none other than the sword saint, Jian Wudao. Chapter 133. Li Hao frowned slightly. He remembered telling Shuer that there was no need for her to ask his master to come down from the mountain and stand up for him. It was pointless. After an 8-year absence, Jian Wudao once again stepped into this courtyard. Upon entering mountain and river courtyard, he saw the young man lying leisurely on a recliner in the sun, looking quite content. He had thought that such a youth should be practicing all the time. He never expected to see him so relaxed, but perhaps it was the calm before the storm, a final respite before the impending battle behind Jian Wudao. For figures followed, all disciples of his, 3 men and a woman. The one with the highest level of cultivation had already entered the 3 immortal realms as well. All 4 of them likewise observed Li Hao, eyes revealing surprise and curiosity. Brother Hao. Bian Ruxue came trotting over with a bright smile, saying, "I've asked the master and the others to come down from the mountain." It disrupted the peace, but faced with the girl's goodwill, Li Hao couldn't bring himself to reprimand her. He simply got up, tossed the poetry collection aside, and sighed internally as he watched the revered swordsman approaching. It was he who had taken the little tag-along away, but it was also he who had let her leave, and the one who truly said farewell to him was the little tag-along herself, so whom could he possibly blame? Li Hao blamed no one, for he had already reigned in those extra feelings. Thus, after a soft sigh, Li Hao set aside the multitude of distractions and greeted with a congenial smile and a cupped fist salute, "Swordsman, your grace remains unchanged." Jian Wudao looked slightly taken aback and asked, "You still remember me? With your peerless elegance." "Jian, how could I forget?" Li Hao replied with a smile. Jian Wudao raised his eyebrows slightly. He had expected this prodigal talent to be either arrogant and unrestrained, or deeply immersed in bitter cultivation, aloof and solitary. He hadn't anticipated the youth would be like a breeze, neither joyous nor sorrowful, exuding a sense of easy freedom found in the wilderness. The Marquis of Xingwu has a fine son. The Li family is set to soar once again, Jian Wudao said calmly. Li Hao smiled. Concluding the pleasantries, Jian Wudao's gaze fell on a black sword box cradled by a girl dressed as a maid next to him. As he had said years before, one obsessed with the sword could spot it immediately among 10,000 weapons. Upon entering mountain and river courtyard, he had indeed noticed the black sword box at first glance, then had turned his attention to the young man. Seeing the sword box, his eyes briefly lit up as he asked, "Could this be Eternal Night?" "Jian, you've seen it before?" It did shine briefly, but alas, it faded into obscurity. Jian Wudao's gaze remained even as he said, "It's a shame for the name, Eternal Night. It should blanket the skies forever, known to all under heaven." "Are you accusing my uncle, Jian?" Li Hao asked lightly. Jian Wudao indeed harbored such a thought. Even though he felt it shouldn't be voiced, his deep respect for the sword meant he was quite dissatisfied when he learned that the name had fallen into dust, sealed away completely. He once visited the mansion to demand it, willing to exchange other promises for it, but the elderly lady had turned him away. However, today's visit was a casual remark. Many years had passed, and there was no use revisiting old matters, especially with a junior. My uncle wielded the sword to worldly acclaim. Within just 3 years, he turned this once obscure forged sword into a renowned one. There is no shame in that, Li Hao said indifferently. Moreover, if my uncle were still alive, the world would surely know of this sword. Of course, had the revered elder Jian been willing to eradicate demons beyond the borders instead of sitting idle within Sword Cottage, perhaps the sword might now be known as the foremost in all the land. Upon hearing the mockery in Li Hao's words, Jian Wudao's expression shifted slightly. The four behind him were also taken aback, their expressions quickly turning as the middle-aged man at the head said with a stern tone, "Mr. Li, please apologize to my master." Li Hao merely glanced at the man, chuckled softly, and said nothing. This was Mountain and River Courtyard, not Sword Cottage. Bian Rushua had not expected a disagreement between her master and Li Hao so soon upon meeting, and caught off guard. She became both nervous and anxious. Jian Wudao looked at Li Hao with a slightly colder gaze and asked dispassionately, "Li has indeed exceptional talent. Now that the sword has been passed on to you, are you worthy of it?" This sword was forged by the Li family, gathering precious metals from across the world. "Whether I'm worthy is hardly for an outsider to comment," Li Hao replied with a smile. Brother Hao. Bian Rushua couldn't help but call out. Li Hao looked at her and saw her distress at being caught in the middle. His smile fading slightly. Years ago, in this very courtyard, perhaps even in this very spot, that little girl stood resolutely by his side, speaking up for him at every turn. Upon hearing she was to be taken away, she cried and said she didn't love the sword anymore, that she would stop practicing. Those days were gone, never to return. Just like the autumn leaves scattered across the courtyard that could never return to the branches they had fallen from. Even if the spring breeze blew anew next year, what would sprout would be new buds at that moment. Several figures hurried from the inner courtyard, led by Li Tiangang, with Yu Xian and Li Fu flanking him on the left and right. Sword Saint Li Tiangang called out to Jian Wudao from afar, then stepped forward and gave a modest salute. "I did not expect you to come in support of my son. I am grateful." Jian Wudao was a powerhouse of his father's generation and had once visited to spar with his father when he was a child, though his father, despite being able to overcome Jian Wudao in overall martial prowess, was not a sword specialist, and thus often narrowly lost in swordsmanship matches. "Support is unnecessary," Jian Wudao replied. Indifferently, "I came out of regard for Schwer, to join the festivities and have a cup of wine. I wonder if the Divine General Mansion welcomes me?" Chapter 134. "That is of course welcome." Li Tiangang was slightly surprised, feeling a hint of barb in the Sword Saint's words, and glancing at Li Hao beside him, he immediately understood. It must be due to Li Hao's casual nature and the lack of proper reception. He immediately said with a smile, "Old sword, please follow me to the inner courtyard." Schwer is a child of bright talent and intelligence. Being able to study under the tutelage of the Sword Saint is indeed good fortune for the child. Seeing this marshal who had controlled the troops for many years being so polite, a smile appeared on Jian Wudao's face. He followed into the courtyard without paying any more attention to Li Hao. After all, their seniority differed too much and it was pointless to squabble with the junior. The disciples following behind Jian Wudao also realized there was no point in arguing with Li Hao. They had come to offer goodwill, but to have a falling out over a verbal dispute would be too costly. But deep down they held a bit more discontent and dislike for the youth who was famous throughout Qinzhou. After they had left, Bian Rushue stood next to Li Hao, her expression hesitant, and said, "Brother Hao, are you angry?" Li Hao sat back down on the chair and smiled. "No, there's nothing to be angry about." Bian Rushue said, "My master takes the way of the sword very seriously, and sometimes he may speak in an unpleasant manner. Brother Hao, don't take it to heart." Li Hao smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not angry." Bian Rushua looked at him carefully, and seeing that he truly wasn't angry, she sighed with relief and said, "I see that Li Qifeng has sought support from the Bodhisattva of Mount Wuliang and thus invited my master. You have worried needlessly." Li Hao understood her kindness and smiled. "Go accompany your master. He is a stranger here. He'll continue to bask in the sun a bit longer." "All right." Bian Rushua nodded at his words. After Bian Rushua had left, Li Hao reopened the book of poetry, placing it on his face, and continued to bask in the sunlight. Next to him, Ren Qianqian held the sword box, frequently glancing towards the inner courtyard. Just now, her heart had been in her throat. The Sword Saint's aura was too powerful and she felt a trembling throughout her body. This was the world-renowned Sword Saint. But the young man before her had responded with ease, without the slightest hint of fear. She was very worried that in his anger, the other party would make a move to teach Li Hao a lesson, but Ren Qianqian's concerns were needless in the divine general mansion. No matter whether Li Hao was at fault or not, Jian Wudao would not lay a hand on him even if he was quick-tempered, as doing so would not only be hitting Li Hao but also damaging the face of the entire divine general mansion. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to the cold and limited connections at Mountain and River Courtyard, the Shuihua Courtyard was extremely bustling and lively. The guests filled the hall and the inner courtyard was already packed. While the outside courtyard was seething with people, maidens and house servants bustled about among guests, busy attending to them. Inside Tan Palace Academy, the many disciples in White Hall wanted to descend the mountain to join the excitement at the divine general mansion to support Li Hao and incidentally see how the Li family's true dragon would make his choice, but a single decree from Song Yufeng stopped them all. Sun Hongdian, who was teaching the class and was very experienced with social customs, slowly explained the reasons behind the decree to the disciples. There were two reasons. The first was that with Li Hao's talent, securing the true dragon was a certainty and there was no need for others to back him up. The second was that Tan Palace Academy did not need to join in on the success, thereby attracting trouble. Immediately, a disciple from the floor yelled out, but Zhou Zheng went. Sun Hongdian chastised bluntly. He went with his father, who was a follower of the Marquis of Martial Justice. Is your father one? The disciple immediately fell silent. Clearly, his father was not. At the edge of the cold pond abyss, two figures stood there, looking down at the distant mountains below, faintly sensing the prosperity and the gathering of many strong presences there. That kid drew you so many pictures, are you not going to see for yourself? Song Yufeng stood with his hands behind his back, smiling at Song Choma beside him. Song Choma glanced at him and said, if I went, aren't you afraid I'd drag Tan Palace into it? Of course, I'm not afraid. Song Yufeng said with a smile, the Li family is also reasonable, and besides, the child will certainly secure the true dragon. What is there to fear in supporting him? Song Choma huffed. If you're not afraid, why did you come to see me? The little guy hasn't been up the mountain for several days, and I see you standing here every day, waiting. I was worried you were bored. Song Yufeng chuckled. Song Choma rolled her eyes. I'm waiting for him to bring little pastries. I never said what you were waiting for. Song Yufeng replied with a smile. Besides, you can go down the mountain to buy them yourself. Song Choma responded gruffly. I promised your ancestor I would stay here. Why confine yourself to a promise for your whole life? Song Yufeng then sighed. Moreover, you've already guarded here for nearly 1,000 years. My Song family is indebted to you. Song Choma remained silent. After a moment, she finally said, speaking of which, he is also a teacher at your Tan Palace. Why don't you go? Song Yufeng started to laugh, his hands still behind his back as he said, I'm only good at offering help in hard times, not at adding splendor to what's already splendid in Mountain and River Courtyard. Apart from the Sword Saint and his company, some more people had arrived one after another. Most of them were individuals Li Tiangang had visited in recent times. They all came to the courtyard to show their support for Li Hao. In the inner courtyard, the guests filled the hall with Li Tiangang sitting at the main hall, chatting and entertaining everyone. From time to time laughter from the middle-aged men could be heard. The few young people, not many in number, stayed in the inner courtyard, sneaking peeks at the young master sunbathing in the front courtyard. Their eyes filled with curiosity but not daring to come closer. The title 15 Li realm by the age of 14 was too intimidating, enough to induce Teacher Li. A figure appeared beside Li Hao, who lifted the book of poetry and saw a familiar face. When alone with Li Hao, Zhou Zhang looked somewhat tense, especially remembering the 100 poems at the brothel. He admired and looked up to this peer of the same age. Chapter 135. Why have you come? Li Hao felt a trace of surprise, and his gaze swiftly swept behind the other, but seeing no other students, he relaxed. Given the status and position of Tan Palace, there was no need to get involved. After all, Tan Palace's students were everywhere. If they became too closely tied to the divine general mansion, it might not bode well. Some relationships are best kept at arm's length, more durable and less likely to be destroyed. I came with my father, Zhou Zhang said respectfully. Li Hao nodded in realization and gestured for him to sit down, not to be constrained by formality. The two casually began to discuss poetry, and many people who saw Zhou Zhang speaking with Li Hao were surprised, memorizing the appearance of this youth to avoid offending him in the future. When the time reached high noon, Li Tiangang led the full hall of guests. Calling Li Hao to his side with Yu Shen, father and son walked at the front, followed by the Sword Saint and the other esteemed guests on their way to Chan Hafang's courtyard. The place was already a sea of people. Packed to the brim, Lu Yurong and others had already arrived early to support Li Qianfeng, and the guests who came for him had also settled in their seats. According to their status and position, seats were filled from the inner courtyard to the outer courtyard. As Li Tiangang and the others arrived, the noise of the crowd quieted down slightly, and all eyes turned towards them when they saw Jian Wudao beside Li Tiangang. Many people's expressions changed slightly, and they exclaimed in low voices many had not expected Li Tiangang to be able to invite the venerable Sword Saint to support his son. After all, this was a top-tier expert of the Four Stands realm, and it was said that he was indifferent to fame and fortune, spending most of his time in meditative seclusion at his sword hermitage. Yet he had been persuaded to come down the mountain, however, when some learned that Li Hao's betrothed was a disciple of the Sword Saint. They found it less surprising after entering the inner courtyard under the arrangements of the housekeeper at the side of the elderly matriarch based on their official ranks, jianghu status, and cultivation levels. Everyone was meticulously and carefully seated, a task of great detail and magnitude, and it was crucial to avoid mistakes. After all, most of those present held great importance on reputation. Jian Wudao and his disciples naturally entered the inner courtyard as they arrived. The chatter among Lu Yurong's guests quietened significantly, and apprehensive glances were cast their way. The four disciples around Jian Wudao revealed a hint of a smirk and pride in their eyes, scanning the young Li of the Li family not far away. Thinking back to the others' disrespectful words earlier, they sneered inwardly. Look at this is the face your master brings you. Sword Saint, it's been a long time. Several figures approached, with the Bodhisattva from Mount Wuliang standing in the middle. The Bodhisattva had a fair complexion, middle-aged appearance, dressed in clean kasaya with hair as black as ink, jade, smiling as he spoke. Jian Wudao's gaze condensed slightly. The Bodhisattva from Mount Wuliang was not in existence to be trifled with. I didn't expect to encounter you here. Jian Wudao, another middle-aged man beside the Bodhisattva, clothed in fine garments and looking contemptuously around, said. Jian Wudao replied indifferently, the dispute between the sword and the saber has not been settled yet. We'll have a chance to test it again. The man was a saber saint from the north many years ago. He had sparred with Jian Wudao, but there was no outcome. Meeting for the first time, I have long heard of the great name of the Sword Saint. Haha, another elder laughed. He was short in stature, dressed in a green robe with a beard that hung down to his abdomen. Jian Wudao's expression was calm. Isn't the monster suppression department supposed to be suppressing demons? Just here for a drink, it won't be a delay, the elder replied with a smile. The other guests at the tables all held their breath slightly. It was rare to see such top figures on ordinary days, and now, for powerful figures from the Four Stands realm were present all at once. The disciples standing behind Jian Wudao also showed subtle changes in their expressions, having originally thought that with their master backing Li Hao, they would at least be evenly matched. They hadn't expected the other side to have brought three figures. After a brief clash, they all returned to their seats. Jian Wudao's expression was cold as he glanced at Li Tiangang and said, if you had only invited me, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to contain the situation. Li Tiangang gave a wry smile. He had anticipated this and said, there's another senior on his way. Who is it? The master of Heavenly Sword Mountain. Jian Wudao's gaze shifted slightly as he said, so it's that fellow. I haven't seen him in a long time. Li Tiangang sighed to himself. It was a pity that even with that person's arrival, they would still be slightly inferior. However, the gap wasn't too wide now. He looked at his son Li Hao, who seemed totally unconcerned and felt helpless. The Sword Saint had been invited by Shuizh and the master of Heavenly Sword Mountain by himself. His son, despite his high cultivation level, had no network of social connections. As Li Tiangang sighed inwardly, suddenly a voice reached the inner courtyard. Announce Arhit from Mount Wuliang pays a visit. Shortly after, a middle-aged man in a kasaya walked into the inner courtyard with a smile. Upon seeing the Bodhisattva seated among the honored guests, he immediately nodded and recited a Buddhist chant. Then, after scanning the area where Li Tiangang and his party were seated and noticing only a sparse table of guests, he seemed slightly surprised before standing in the center and saying, I was ordered to come. Where's the Qiankuan Vidra? Li Qianfeng was slightly astonished and stood up to approach. Li Qianfeng is here. I have seen the Arhat. The infinite Buddha Lord has sent me to gift a string of Buddha beads to the Qiankuan Vidra, the Arhat said with a smile. He obviously knew Li Qianfeng. His purpose in speaking so loudly was merely to bolster Li Qianfeng's presence. Sure enough, upon hearing the Arhat's words, all the guests in the courtyard were stunned, looking at him in shock. The infinite Buddha Lord seated high atop Mount Wuliang was also supporting him? Both Jian Wudao and Li Tiangang's expressions changed slightly, growing somewhat grim. If that Buddha Lord intervened, even the Master of Heavenly Sword Mountain's arrival would be of no use. Had I known this earlier, Shuer wouldn't have needed to go through so much trouble, Jian Wudao said, shaking his head. Now that he knew, he wouldn't have needed to leave the mountain either. Upon hearing this, Li Tiangang shook slightly and sighed. Indeed, they were outmatched, but fortunately, connections were not decisive. Thank you, Master. In front of everyone, Li Chiefeng received the Buddha beads from the Arhat's hand and expressed his thanks respectfully. The Arhat smiled slightly, about to say something, when suddenly another voice came from behind. Announce. An edict from Emperor Yu has arrived, summoning the son of the Li family, Li Hao, to receive the decree. In an instant, the courtyard fell silent, still as death. Chapter 136. An imperial edict from Emperor Yu. In the silent courtyard, everyone looked in unison toward one spot. There, a noble young man was seated with poise, and next to him stood a young girl holding a large black sword box. Upon hearing this announcement, Li Hao was somewhat astonished. Emperor Yu. At the same time, his table companions Li Tiangang, Jian Wudao, and their several disciples all turned their gazes towards Li Hao, their eyes filled with surprise and confusion. For whatever the reason, Li Hao quickly stood up and saw that, accompanying the footsteps, a group of figures walked in from outside the courtyard, flanked by the mansion's trusted aides. The central figures were the few top students holding the imperial decree. Who is Li Hao? An old eunuch in a purple robe asked. His gaze swept around, and seeing the full courtyard of guests, he was not surprised. However, upon seeing the presence of the Sword Saint, the Bodhisattva, and others in the Four Stands realm, his eyes narrowed slightly. At this moment, the previously brief silence in the courtyard was replaced by many low whispers. Seeing this old eunuch, some couldn't help but be shocked. This was a favored figure by Emperor Ye's side, once serving the former emperor. Himself a being of the Four Stands realm, even in the noble courts, he was an extremely formidable character. Unexpectedly, he personally came to deliver the imperial decree. In the past, the imperial decrees of rewards from the 5 great divine general mansions were mostly issued by this very Chu. But these were usually for the generation of Li Hao's grandparents. Occasionally, for great deeds accomplished by the generation of Li Tiangang's father, he would come to issue them as well. Unexpectedly, now, Li Hao, just a junior of the 3rd generation, also merited his personal delivery of the decree. Greetings, eunuch. By this time, Li Hao had quickly stepped forward, slightly bowing with hands clasped in a formal salutation. Chu Jiuyue assessed the youth with a smile and said, "Indeed, a dragon and phoenix among men, a person of great talent. There's no need for excessive formalities. Earl's son, please receive the decree." Hearing him mention Earl, many people suddenly realized that this young man not only possessed an exceptional cultivation talent but also held the title of an Earl. His dazzling talent overshadowed his noble title to such an extent that it was easy for others to overlook it. By this title alone, he surpassed half of those present. Seeing the implication in his words, Li Hao immediately accepted the decree in accordance with his status as an earl, merely bending slightly at the waist. Without this title, even as the son of Marquis Xingwu, he would have been required to kneel to receive the decree. In recognition of the Li family's eternal merit and Marquis Xingwu's excellent teachings in the past, Li Jiolong, Marquis of the defending nation, led his iron cavalry to guard the borders and sacrificed his life for the state today. Fortunately, we have this son whose talents are unmatched through the ages, his nature sincerely genuine, unlike common folk, wise and learned, benevolent and supremely kind. The Li family having such a son is a blessing for the millions of people in Great Dayu. This edict was quite detailed, and as Chu Jiuyue recited it, each word was softly spoken out, filling the perfectly quiet courtyard, initially praising Li Hao's father, and then once again mentioning that Li family true dragon who established tremendous military exploits more than a decade ago. But the real focus of the praise was on Li Hao himself. His talent was only briefly described as unmatched through the ages. But even without saying more, those present knew just how terrifying the youth's talent was. After all, many major forces had records, and aside from some exceptional cases, Li Hao's cultivation speed had broken all previous records. The key point of this edict was, however, Li Hao's character, 6 adjectives in total. This evidently showed how much Emperor Great Yu admired him. To receive such high praise, over centuries counted only a handful of figures. Li Hao received the decree. Chu Jiuyue said with a smile. Li Hao promptly responded with respect, feeling a bit overwhelmed by the favor. When had this emperor ever met him to give him such high praise? This was no longer merely showing support for him. With such a profuse praise in the decree, there was no need to test his character when his role as the true dragon was being decided. After all, with the emperor using 6 words of praise in the decree, who would dare to claim Li family's child failed in character? Whose face would that slap? Gripping the decree in both hands, Li Hao once again thanked this internal official. Chu Jiuyue smiled slightly and said, "Now that I am here, I might as well partake of some wine from Li Mansion to share the joy of the Earl's son. Would that be welcomed?" "That would be most welcome," Li Hao said smilingly, knowing well that the other intended to stay and support him. Hearing their conversation, the people in the courtyard also came back to their senses, their expressions shifting, their eyes filled with complex emotions. Those who had come to support Li Qianfeng on the other side had unpleasant expressions. Apart from the Lu family relatives, most who wished to seek favor through Li Qianfeng felt extremely uneasy. When did these chairs start feeling so prickly? Meanwhile, Li Tiangang quickly stood up and approached with a smile. "Chu, it was a long journey. Please sit down, make yourself comfortable," and invited him to sit in the seat reserved for honored guests. Chu Jiuyue advanced with a smile. Following Li Hao back to the table, those who were initially sitting around the table, seeing this favored figure of the emperor, also a 4-stands realm powerhouse, stood up, including the disciples of the Sword Saint. The Sword Saint remained seated but also exhibited a smile, saying, "Chu, it has been a while since I've seen you. Well, the Sword Saint indeed has good judgment." Chu Jiuyue smiled. Obviously, his remark was referring to the Sword Saint coming to support Li Hao. Upon hearing this, Jian Wudeo's face showed a hint of embarrassment. He had come to support Li Hao not because of Li Hao himself, but at the earnest request of his own disciple. He was particularly fond of his little disciple Bian Ruxue, and since the other party had communicated in a letter that he had chosen the sword Dao, it had made him even more pleased. Thus he readily agreed to descend the mountain for him. As Chu Jiuyue took his seat, others also bowed and greeted him. Even though this powerhouse was a top student, no one dared to take him lightly, let alone them. Even princes of that noble court would call him Chu. "Please take your seats. No need to stand on ceremony." Chu Jiuyue smiled and waved, signaling everyone to sit down. Next to Chu Jiuyue was Li Hao holding the imperial edict. He summoned Qin Shi, a maid waiting outside, to take the edict back to the mountain and river courtyard and keep it safe to prevent it from getting stained by drinks during the meal. Li Tiangang glanced at the imperial edict in Emperor Ye's handwriting and couldn't help but ask Chu Jiuyue curiously, "Chu, may I know when Emperor Yu met my son? Could it be that he has visited Qingzhou?" This question made everyone else look curiously towards Chu Jiuyue, and Li Hao himself was also filled with curiosity. When had he ever met Emperor Yu? Could it be that the old man he played chess with by the riverbank was the emperor seated on the dragon throne? But it didn't seem likely. Emperor Ye's skill in chess probably wasn't that poor, right? Moreover, it was said that Emperor Yu was in his prime, his stature mountainous, his gaze piercing the heavens. Yet that man was an old man. Seeing everyone's curiosity, Chu Jiuyue chuckled inwardly. He had heard that Emperor Yu had left the Dragon Court a few days ago, but he did not know exactly where he had gone. After all, Emperor Yu would occasionally go out for a stroll, sometimes taking him along, and sometimes alone. Naturally, he wouldn't inquire about His Majesty's whereabouts. However, upon returning, Emperor Yu had sent him on this errand, which most likely meant the emperor had probably visited this place before. But how could he possibly divulge His Majesty's leisurely whereabouts? That would only bring discomfort upon himself. As for the specific reason, I'm unsure, Chu Jiuyue said with a smile. Perhaps it is out of respect for the ancestors of the Li family, or maybe hearing about the young lord's talent and having someone keep an eye out. In any case, congratulations to Marquis Xingwu for acquiring such a promising son. Hearing this, everyone thought it might indeed be plausible. After all, the imperial edict had praised the Li family, and it seemed the emperor had quite a favorable view of Li Hao, almost hoping he could inherit Li Junya's talents and become famous throughout Day. Furthermore, Li Hao's reputation had resounded throughout Qingzhou City, reaching the ears of the emperor, so it wasn't strange for him to send someone to make contact. To have gained Emperor Ye's appreciation is an honor for my son. I should thank His Majesty, Li Tiangang said hastily. Li Hao's temperament had always been a source of headaches for him, but surprisingly, it had caught Emperor Ye's eye, which greatly astonished him. Chu Jiuyue just smiled. Saying nothing more, Jian Wudao looked at Li Hao, his brow slightly furrowed, but he said nothing. His 4 disciples, however, had complex expressions in their eyes. With Li Hao having this imperial decree from Emperor Yu, even without their master's presence, it was enough to suppress Li Qianfeng's connections. After all, speaking of connections, who could surpass Emperor Yu? Not even the Buddha Lord, nor the true person of Gon Tao Palace, could compare what is an emperor, the supreme ruler of the mortal world. Bien Ruxu's eyes twinkled as she gazed at the youth who looked tranquil and affable amidst the gathering. His presence reminding her greatly of her childhood, when he had stood out significantly in settings most unfavorable to him. Before long, the Bodhisattva of Immeasurable Mountain, among other 4 stands realm powerhouses from another table, also came to exchange greetings with Chujua. After all, being someone from Emperor Yes' inner circle and able to convey messages to the highest authority, they dared not offend or provoke him. After the pleasantries, they returned to Li Qianfeng's side. Lu Yurong smiled, though her smile was a bit forced, the fingers beneath the table almost pinching blood. At that moment, she had only one thought in her mind: regret for making Li Hao swallow that poison pill that disabled his divine blood. Instead, she should have directly poisoned him to death. Even if it were riskier, it would have been worth it. Who could have imagined that the boy from back then would now be so spirited and striking? And this was even under the circumstances where his divine blood had been disabled. If he were to awaken his divine blood, he might shine even brighter. But she did not know that the addition of divine blood to the physical strength greatly diminished the impact on Li Hao's cultivation of various body refinement techniques. I never expected Emperor Yu to issue an imperial edict. It seems our presence here was in vain. Jiang Haiping said as he downed a cup of wine, sighing. Xiang Yuguang, one of the leaders of the monster suppression department, maintained a calm expression, but his mind was somewhat gloomy. He had come to support Li Qianfeng, but it seemed this move was a mistake. Others were manageable, like Jiang Haiping and the Bodhisattva, who were among the top masters in the Jianghu, but he was different. He held an official position, and the ultimate authority above that position was the emperor. He had inadvertently sided against the emperor. Madame Lu, I apologize. After pondering for a moment, Xiang Yuguang spoke to Lu Yurong, then suddenly stood up, saying, I just remembered I have something to attend to at home. I must head back now, please. Continue without me. After saying this, he bowed slightly and then turned to leave. Before departing, he noticed Chu Jiuyue, Li Tiangang, and others looking his way. He offered a slight smile, nodded to them, and then hurried away. Lu Yurong managed a strained smile, but the anger in her eyes was nearly uncontrollable. Noticing her emotional shift, Bodhisattva Lin Wujing beside her said with a smile, Madam, there's no need to worry too much at this point. It all depends on Qianfeng's fate. I believe in Qianfeng. His expression remained gentle, seemingly undisturbed by external matters, untainted by dust. Lu Yurong glanced at him, thinking that since it was not his own burden, of course he could speak lightly of it. However, thinking about the secret information he had shared, she felt somewhat relieved. While Li Hao's cultivation speed was indeed faster than her son's, the depth of mastery in each realm was another matter. Chapter 137. Indeed, Mother, you can rest assured, connections do not determine everything. Otherwise, the Li family's true dragon would have been left for His Majesty to select. Beside her, Li Qianfeng spoke calmly. He gave the other young man a cold glance, then withdrew his gaze, feeling a slight disturbance in his heart at the imperial edict, some displeasure. However, the thought of winning the true dragon to astonish the emperor, making him realize his misjudgment, was quite satisfying. Hearing her son's composed words, Lu Yurong revealed a slight smile on her face. At that moment, Elder Chen Hufang emerged. She had heard everything that was going on in the courtyard but had not shown herself. Now, she greeted the full courtyard of guests with a few opening remarks and a smile, allowing everyone to continue with the banquet. Eating was naturally secondary, but Li Hao did not hold back. After all, how could he have the energy later if he did not eat his fill? While he gorged himself, Li Tiangang, Jian Wudao, Chu Jiuyue, and others were enjoying a lively conversation, discussing past events and praising Li Hao's talents. Of course, when the discussion came to Li Hao, Jian Wudao had considerably less to say. He even refrained from mentioning the incident when he wanted to take Li Hao as his disciple, but was refused to avoid embarrassment at the banquet and mockery from others. Despite that, he did not regret his actions back then, for Li Hao was not a lover of swords and would have limited achievements in the art of the sword. This was a realization he kept to himself. His disciples could understand it, but it might not be so for the common folk who would think he lacked discernment. Having feasted to his satisfaction, Li Hao got an empty plate, helped himself to some of the delicious dishes, and had Ren Qianqian standing behind him take it to the little white fox in the corner of the courtyard. The little creature had also stealthily come to join in the fun but did not dare to get too close. Ever since his father Li Tiangang returned, the little white fox had been hiding in Li Hao's room, no longer frolicking around the courtyard like before. Let alone causing trouble in the kitchen of other courtyards. Li Hao could also feel that the little creature was extremely afraid of his father. This made him sigh, knowing the little creature was wronged, yet what was his to pamper he would cherish. As everyone was nearly done eating, Chen Hufang once again stepped forward, bringing out the real feast, the selection of the Li family's true dragon. All the guests craned their necks in anticipation, their eyes shifting back and forth between the two young men. A figure descended from the sky, landing in the courtyard with white hair fluttering. It was Li Qingjing. Seeing this elder of the Li family, all present inevitably rose to their feet. Even Jian Wudao treated the moment with a slightly more solemn look, though he remained seated without moving decades ago. Although Li Qingjing did not obtain the position of the Li family's true dragon, losing to Li Tiangang's father, he was an exceedingly formidable warrior, but as the years passed, the once bloodthirsty demon of the frontier pass seemed to have cultivated his disposition, shedding his aura of killing, and now bore a refined and gentle temperament. Sister-in-law Li Qingjing nodded slightly to Chen Hufang, their eyes meeting, but they did not exchange pleasantries. Descendants of the Li family, step forward. Li Qingjing turned and said. Hearing this, Li Mingguang, Li Sibei, and others all stood out one after another. Li Hao and Li Qianfeng did likewise, moving to the open space in the center of the courtyard. Those willing to bear the Li family's legacy, to protect the common folk, step forward. Li Qingjing spoke again. Upon hearing this, all eyes converged, falling upon the two figures. Li Mingguang and others remained stationary, while Li Hao and Li Qianfeng both stepped forward simultaneously. But at that moment, a slight commotion came from the back. It was the daughter of 8 Aunt, Li Rumeng, who also stepped forward. However, a soft reprimand from 8 Uncle Li Fenghua quickly followed from the side. Rumeng, stop fooling around. Come back. Li Rumeng, hearing her father's call, pouted slightly, but still retracted her step. That half-step made her feel the weight of countless eyes on her and the oppressive atmosphere around her. The small disturbance was quickly smoothed over, and many were surprised, giving the young girl a few extra glances, only to chuckle and shake their heads after realizing she was only in the initial soul succession realm. The girl was about the same age as Li Hao, but only at the initial stage of the soul succession realm. What audacity she had to step forward! Soon, as Li Hao and Li Qianfeng settled into position, Li Qingjing, seeing no one else moved, immediately said, Others may step back now. Li Mingguang and the others promptly turned and left, returning to their seats, their gaze resting on the two cousins, curious to see just how capable they really were. Cultivation level was one thing. Actual strength was another, relating to the foundation of one's cultivation, combat experience, and the level of one's cultivation technique. Just like the Li family's early soul succession realm warriors, capable of slaying ordinary practitioners at the 8th layer. Have the two of you thought this through? Li Qingjing looked down upon them, scrutinizing Li Hao and Li Qianfeng, and at this moment, he did not display the usual favoritism toward Li Hao, treating them equally. Once one becomes a true dragon, they must dedicate their lives to the family, holding the family above all else. Are you prepared in your hearts for this? Yes. Li Hao and Li Qianfeng spoke at the same time. Li Qingjing nodded and smiled, saying, In that case, let us first test your character. He looked at Li Hao. I've just heard the praise from Emperor Yes Edict, and your character need not be tested. Li Qianfeng, please step forward. As he took out a censer, about to perform some act, someone from the opposite side of the banquet stood up. It was Lin Wujing from Mount Wuliang, the Bodhisattva. He murmured a short Buddhist chant and softly said, Elder Li, just now our Buddha master has gifted a strand of Chenkuin Vajra Buddha beads. The fact that Chenkuin Vajra has received such a gift from our Buddha master shows his pure nature. Should he become the Li family's true dragon in the future, he shall surely be a benevolent and righteous leader with the world in his heart. Li Qingjing frowned slightly, feeling somewhat uneasy, but he knew that the face of the Buddha master had to be given its due respect. To gift Buddha beads was to bypass the test of character, and it also implied that if Li Qianfeng were to inherit the position of true dragon, he might receive support from Mount Wuliang. For hundreds of years, the Li family had dealings with Mount Wuliang, and other noble families' offspring had been disciples there, but while their relationship was amiable, it was not particularly intimate. If the position of the true dragon were to be transferred to Li Qianfeng, who is a direct disciple of the Buddha, that relationship would surely ascend to a new level, but this is the Li family's true dragon, all things considered. The future of the Li family remains paramount. Connections. Temperament. Frankly, they are merely icing on the cake. For instance, if both parties are equally matched and their talents are similar, then the one with a better temperament and connections would naturally be chosen, but if the gap in talent is vast, what use are connections? Could it be that in the future, everything will depend on connections, reducing the Li family to mere puppets? Therefore, it's acceptable to extend this courtesy to the Buddha himself. If, after a thorough comparison, Li Qianfeng is found inferior to Li Hao, there can be no complaints if he fails to be chosen. Upon reaching this conclusion, Li Qizheng put away the incense burner and said with an indifferent smile, "Since the Buddha himself has scrutinized on behalf of my Li family, then there's no need to waste any more time. The character of my Li family's sons won't be inferior." The crowd remained silent. What a way to seize the opportunity to boast. Li Qizheng smiled, then turned his gaze to the two in the middle, saying, "Both of you are of similar age and realm. My Li family's true dragon will undoubtedly be the best of this generation and unrivaled in all the world. You may discuss how to proceed amongst yourselves, or I can make the arrangements." Hearing his words, Li Qianfeng turned to face Li Hao with a cold gaze. But he looked directly at Li Hao. "Since we are at the same realm, why not just spar directly to avoid all the unnecessary formalities? What do you say?" Li Hao smiled. "That sounds excellent, decisive." The corner of Li Qianfeng's mouth curled slightly, then immediately he said, "I am 4 years your senior. When I was your age, I hadn't yet reached the 15 Li realm, so I shall bind one arm. What do you think?" "Acceptable," Li Hao nodded, but in reality his opponent was taking advantage. If Li Qianfeng reduced his cultivation level to that of when he was 14 before had reached the 15 Li realm, there would be no point in sparring at all. The assembled crowd realized that Li Qianfeng was taking advantage, but since most of the supportive voices were on Li Qianfeng's side, naturally no one said anything. On the side of Li Tiangang, however, brows were furrowed. Li Tiangang wanted to speak up and suggest a different approach, but since Li Hao had already agreed, he could only frown, silently sighing to himself. Though his son was extremely talented, he was perhaps a bit too arrogant as a swordsman. Li Qianfeng would suffer little difference from binding an arm. It would simply mean wielding his sword with one hand. Chu Jiuyue and Jian Wudao simply observed quietly, showing no emotion. They were there to lend their support. But the outcome of the battle for the true dragon of the Li family didn't greatly affect them. Even if Li Qianfeng became the true dragon in the future, they wouldn't dare seek revenge. They would remain polite and courteous. After all, who would want to establish a powerful enemy at the Four Stands realm for their clan? Seeing Li Hao agree so easily, a smile appeared on Li Qianfeng's lips. He expected as much. The opponent was young and reckless. If he initiated the suggestion, the other party would most likely accept it before the public. But he intended to let the other side realize that the 4 extra years he had lived were not in vain. Among the crowd, Li Rong and Lin Wujing both secretly breathed a sigh of relief. If Li Hao had forcefully demanded Li Qianfeng to suppress this cultivation level to that of when he was 14, it would have likely led to a more difficult verbal exchange. They were already prepared to argue about it. For example, they could claim that although Li Qianfeng was at the divine travel realm at the age of 14, he had spent time studying other cultivation techniques which had hindered his progress, and so on. Whether these arguments would be convincing was not essential, but if brought up for debate, they could win some leverage. After all, the guests present were not just there to enjoy the feast. Shouting out a few words was expected. If the Li family's true dragon did not have outstanding strength, then rhetorical skills and connections would come into play, but Li Hao's youthful arrogance saved them the trouble of verbal sparring. This was excellent. Since that is the case, then go ahead and prepare. Li Qizheng hadn't expected Li Hao to agree so readily. He usually found Li Hao to be not overly proud, which left him slightly surprised, but since Li Hao had already agreed, he too had no choice but to assent. At that moment he casually waved his hand, covering the tables, chairs, and houses in the courtyard with his power, and then stepped back, leaving the duel to them. Sword. Li Qianfeng's eyes turned sharp as he called out lightly. A metallic ring sounded, followed by a streak of snow-white silver light weaving through the seats towards him. It came from the sword of the woman who had been holding it for him at his dining spot. That woman was Murong Qiulan, who had accompanied Li Qianfeng. Her eyes shone with dazzling light as she focused on the extraordinary young man, poised and dignified in the middle of the courtyard. This was the image of her ideal husband. The figure that had stood in front of her in the demon forest re-emerged in her mind. At this moment, the sword was in hand. Li Qianfeng's expression was lofty as he glanced at Ren Qianqian, who was not far from Li Hao holding the black sword box. Internally, he felt somewhat uncomfortable with the battle for the true dragon imminent. Although he too had received a peerless technique, it required time to master, which meant it brought him no short-term benefits, but the famed sword was different. Even if Li Hao's cultivation level was limited and couldn't unleash its true might, its sheer sharpness was already terrifying. If their swords were to clash directly later, he would have to avoid its edge for the time being. Draw your sword. Despite his wariness of the famed sword, Li Qianfeng spoke out loud. Li Hao noticed his opponent's gaze and caught the fleeting solemnity. He smiled slightly. Use Eternal Night? You are not worthy. Li Hao did not even glance at Ren Qianqian. Instead, he turned around and summoned a pair of chopsticks from the table where he had been eating. Chapter 138. Seeing Li Hao's actions, Li Qianfeng was immediately stunned. Soon after, his eyes widened slightly as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and his whole body started to tremble slightly with anger. What do you mean? He asked. I'm afraid I might hurt you with a sword, so I'll use this instead, said Li Hao with a slight smile. However, deep down, he was filled with a cold intent to kill. When the people in the yard heard Li Hao's words, they were all shocked, doubting their own ears. Facing off against Li Qianfeng, of the same 15 Li realm and a direct disciple of the Buddha, considered a top prodigy, Li Hao actually planned to fight with only a chopstick? What does it mean to be reckless in one's youth? They had truly witnessed it today. This was no longer mere rashness, but thorough contempt, looking down upon everything. At the banquet, Li Tiangang's complexion changed drastically, filled with shock and anger in his eyes. Previously, he had merely thought Li Hao to be arrogant, which he could barely understand after all. With no one to guide him and achieving such a terrifying cultivation level at the age of 14, it's no surprise he would be arrogant, but now it was more than just arrogance, it was arrogance to the extreme. If it had been an ordinary 15 Li realm opponent, perhaps there was a chance of winning, but Li Qianfeng was a disciple of the Buddha. Moreover, even if Li Hao really had such ability, so what? Using a chopstick to defeat his cousin would be such a blow to Li Qianfeng, causing him to never be able to hold his head high again, perhaps even shattering his resolve and ruining his life. If that were the case, how could Li Tiangang face his deceased brother? Those at the banquet, like Jian Wudao and Chu Jue, were shocked and had never expected this gifted young man to be so insane. A chopstick defeating a prodigy. How could that be possible? Was he replacing the sword with a chopstick? Jian Wudao was puzzled as he watched Li Hao's stance, combined with the fact that the Li family had presented him with a famous sword. He was most likely a practitioner of the sword, however, remembering the look in the eyes of that child all those years ago. He couldn't help but shake his head inwardly. Ever since the mention of the Eternal Night famous sword, he had been displeased, feeling that the Li family had once again buried a famous sword. This boy could not possibly achieve anything on the path of the sword. Compared to the three of them, Lu Yurong and Sword St. Jiang Haiping were both shocked and angry, but also a little pleased. This Li Hao's madness was self-destructive. This thought also emerged in the minds of most of the guests present. Indeed, a genius is still a genius, but they also have the flaws of a genius, and these very flaws often lead to their early demise. Li Qianfeng stared at Li Hao. Although the young man's face wore a warm smile, through his eyes, Li Qianfeng could feel the contempt. I will make you pay the price, Li Qianfeng said through clenched teeth. Word by word, his aura suddenly expanded, causing his robes to billow, and with a sudden swing of his sword, he exclaimed in a low voice while grinding his teeth, Take my sword. Li Hao stood calmly, his smile already faded, not even interested in forging a sarcastic smirk. The clear sword chi fiercely cut towards him, lifting the hem of Li Hao's robes and causing his hair to fly. With the chopstick in his hand, he casually flicked it, sending out a slash of sword chi with a loud bang. The two sword chi instantly collided and neutralized each other, whipping up dust from the ground. The tables and houses around, covered by Li Qianfeng's power, were not affected, but, realizing that the two had already began fighting, Li Qianzhang suddenly remembered that he had not invited the ancestral spirits from the shrine to temporarily release their heart oath for them. But soon, he came back to his senses. As neither of them followed the Li family ancestor's soul lineage, they didn't have to worry about hurting the other and breaking the oath. This kid, Li Qianzhang muttered to himself, but his gaze was fixed on the center of the courtyard. At first, He was sure that Li Hao could win, but now he was somewhat nervous at Li Hao's overconfidence. The brief exchange clearly didn't use full strength, but they seemed evenly matched, which surprised those around them. Jian Wudao's eyes narrowed slightly. The sword chi that the young man had just flicked out seemed to have a naturally perfect feel to it. Li Qianfeng's eyes were cold, with a hint of murderous intent. He had not expected the opponent's control of objects to be so powerful. Now, he was not holding back anymore and suddenly raised his aura to its peak. Like a war god wielding a sword technique, Bright Moon, rising. Li Qianfeng unleashed his strongest move, intending to crush Li Hao with one blow. A terrible sword intent gathered in his palm, the sharp sword chi extending outwards, causing everyone around to change color, feeling as if their throats were being slit. It's the Li family's endless sea sword skill. To think he has understood it up to the third layer, reaching such a level at such a young age. Such a high talent in swordsmanship. This sword is hard to receive for anyone less than a grandmaster. Everyone was in shock, their gazes solemn. Ren Chanqian stood outside the open ground holding the sword box with a gleam in her eyes. That sword felt so familiar, but it seemed quite different from what she saw that day, much more rudimentary. As Li Hao saw the sword technique utilized by his opponent, his eyes were cold and indifferent. A mere perfect level, indeed admirable, but still not enough. He slowly lifted the chopstick in his hand. In an instant, a dazzling light burst forth from his fingertips, endless sea bright moon rising. Suddenly, a bright moon lit up the entire courtyard, and it also illuminated a myriad of eyes. Even in broad daylight, the brilliance of that moon could not be overshadowed. Jian Wudao had been regretting that such a sword prodigy like Li Qianfeng had not become his disciple. But now, his eyes suddenly widened. The wrinkled lids at the edges of his old eyes seemed to stretch wide open with astonishment. Is that the genuine realm? Jian Wudao suddenly stood up, his composure lost, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the young man. Aside from him, his 4 disciples, including Bian Ruxue, all wore expressions of shock, incredulously watching the scene unfold as sword cultivators. How could they not perceive the terror and sheer brilliance of that strike? The radiance from the ancient city wall once again illuminated heaven and earth. Ren Chanqian's palms, clutching the black sword box, tightened, whitening at the knuckles. Her eyes filled with the glow and the silhouette of the youth. How? Li Yuanzhao, too, was so excited that he clenched his fists tightly. What? Lu Yurong, upon seeing that bright moon, had her originally mocking gaze freeze, slightly lost for words. Next to her, Jiang Haiping the war god, Bodhisattva Lin Wujing, and others were also shocked. They had not expected that, apart from his cultivation level, Li Hao's swordsmanship would reach such an extent, truly a rare sword prodigy seen once in 1,000 years. At this moment, however, the one who felt it the most was Li Qianfeng. He was immensely shocked. Reaching a perfect level was already incredibly remarkable, and his uncle at this age was not even as skilled. But the youth before him, before he could ponder any further, that bright moon had already crushed down on him, all from a single chopstick. Li Qianfeng's eyes bulged with fury, and immense shame made him bellow out, his hair flying wildly as he roared. Break! 2 identical sword techniques collided, but in the next moment, Li Qianfeng's body was sent flying backward, crashing forcefully into a banquet table and spitting out a mouthful of fresh blood. His richly ornate brocade garments were now riddled with tatters and tears. A mere brief encounter, yet already so scarred and damaged. And this was because Li Hao had only used a single chopstick. Had he used a sword, it wouldn't just be superficial cuts, but blood sprayed all over. Li Qianfeng climbed up from the ground, his gaze furiously shifting toward Li Hao, eyes filled with shock. Even though his own swordsmanship was not on the same level as his opponent's, the disparity in their weapons was vast. Yet his sword had not managed to break Li Hao's chopstick. He could feel that in that moment of clashing, the force of object control wrapped around the opponent's chopstick had steered his sword off course. And there hadn't been a true clash. He had sparred with others of the 15 Li realm using the same method, defeating them, but he did not expect to face the same situation himself. This could only be achieved by a complete overpowering of object control forces. But he had practiced one of the most top-notch object control chi circulation skills. To surpass him, it would have to be the royal family's 9 heavens ascension skill. Yet even then, the difference shouldn't be this vast. Under Li Qianfeng's watch, Li Hao was calmly approaching. Li Qianfeng's pupils shrank. His heart filled with grief and humiliation. He had thought to suppress Li Hao with his own power, but instead, he found himself pressured to this extent. He had been cultivating for 4 more years, his eyes nearly bursting with fury. He restrained the murderous intent showing on his face, but inside, he was seething, "Die!" Suddenly, the power within him gathered in his chest and violently unleashed the force imparted to him by his master. A humming sound, like the evening drum and the morning bell, seemed to herald a rampaging force, buzzing through his mind immediately afterward. A terrifying power surged from his chest into his limbs and bones, reaching the pinnacle of his qi and blood, and his strength exploded. At the same time, the major meridians within his body that had not been opened began to break through one by one at this moment, as the raging power poured into these meridians. Although it was only temporary, it filled all of them up in just an instant. Li Qianfeng's meridians in his body increased from 58 to 82. The meridian tempering skill of the Li family was opened to 54 meridians. The top-tier meridian tempering skill passed down to him by Mount Wuliang's Buddhist master was 58 meridians, and the first meridian tempering technique of the royal family was 62 meridians. Under the impact of this force, his major meridians were forcibly opened to 82 meridians. That was a full 20 more than the royal family's meridian tempering method. This increase in meridian power gave him a sensation of free flow throughout his body, and at the same time, there seemed to be a low chant of Buddha's teachings in his mind as his soul power also surged, and his mind became clearer than ever before, with his divine soul's power expanding rapidly. It grew from the original 20 li all the way to 30 li. Even the royal family would pale in comparison. With the enhancement of his divine soul's power, the power to manipulate objects followed suit. Li Qianfeng felt the power within his entire body increasing rapidly, feeling as if he could pluck stars and seize moons with his hands. His eyes were fierce as he rose from the ground, facing the youth. He then suddenly put his movement technique to use, his figure like a streak of light, the power to manipulate objects bolstering him. He rushed forward almost as if teleporting. He wouldn't give his opponent a chance to react, nor would he allow others the chance to intervene. He intended to disable Li Hao with a single sword strike. The surging aura of Li Qianfeng naturally attracted the attention of countless onlookers who were all shocked, not knowing what cultivation technique this was. Li Qianfeng's face changed slightly, ready to take action, but suddenly, Li Hao's figure, which was moving with large strides, accelerated fiercely, not running away, but charging towards Li Qianfeng. The two figures intersected almost instantly, moving so quickly that below the 15 li realm, they could barely be seen, just a gray afterimage. Li Qianfeng slashed fiercely at Li Hao, but in the next moment, he felt a tiger's fierce momentum coming from Li Hao, causing his pupils to shrink with shock in his eyes. His sword struck at the chopsticks, but they slipped away. The chopsticks stabbed straight towards his eye socket. Li Qianfeng's other hand swung out hastily, using the Buddhist palm skill, which was a form of fist and kick technique that could enhance weapon blocking as well. But the arm that was meant to be sealed was grabbed by Li Hao at an even faster speed, catching hold of his palm, as if grabbing a soft sponge. 98 meridians, plus the power of circulating qi 369 times, and the instant double explosion of power from the yin and yang dual pulse, led to his palm being directly crushed, the bones and flesh mangled together, and before Li Qianfeng could scream, Li Hao's chopstick had already plunged in, piercing into his eyeball with a loud bang. A sudden shock wave spread out, but simultaneously, and even more vast. Power enveloped down, protecting Li Hao. A white figure swept by. It was the Buddhist Bodhisattva. He appeared in front of both Li Hao and Li Qianfeng, separating the two on the spot and carrying Li Qianfeng out to a dozen meters away. Such a ruthless move. Lin Wujing's gaze was slightly cold as he glanced at Li Hao, then immediately looked down at Li Qianfeng, whose eyeball had been pierced. Chapter 139. Lin Wujing. A roar of fury rose, followed by Li Qingzheng arriving in a flash in his snow-white robe, positioning himself in front of Li Hao. His commonly gentle eyes now shot out a cold light, causing the temperature of the entire courtyard to seem to plummet suddenly. He did not address Lin Wujing with the honorific Great Phono Saint, but instead called him by his actual name, which was extremely discourteous. Lin Wujing, however, turned his head and looked at him indifferently. The struggle for the true dragon of the Li family has actually become lethal. Had I not acted in time, Chinquinvadra would likely be dead by now. Are you implying that you want to blame me? These words made Li Qingjing pause slightly. His anger stemmed from the other party's unauthorized intervention in the Li family's true dragon selection. But if he blamed Lin Wujing now, wouldn't that imply he tacitly agreed to let Li Hao kill Li Qianfeng? Naturally, that was unacceptable. If Lin Wujing had not acted just now, he would have intervened himself with his cultivation level at the Four Stands realm. He could have easily intervened in time, even with only one eye open. This is the Li family's true dragon contest. How heir knows his own limits, Bodhisattva, please show some respect. In the end, Li Qingjing still found a way to regain some face with his words. At the same time, his statement was also meant for others to hear, as he was making excuses for Li Hao during that instant before. How could he not have seen that Li Hao had murderous intent? Having killed countless demons on the borders, his perception of killing intent was extremely sharp, however. Aside from Li Hao, he also perceived that Li Qianfeng harbored murderous intent. The relationship between these two juniors was not as peaceful as that of other cousins, not to mention compared to their fathers, the joyful times of the 9 sons of the Li family. Although they were all blood and clan, the relationship was still separated by a generation. Li Qingjing couldn't help but inwardly sigh. Such incidents were not the first to occur. With a history of 1,000 years, such disputes were unavoidable in the Li family, even in the lineage of the imperial family. But all were concealed and suppressed. That's why the Li family had tests of character. Impartial love was an ancestral teaching. Lin Wujing knew Li Qingjing was being stubborn but coldly snorted and said, Qianfeng's eyeball needs prompt medical treatment. Otherwise, if it affects the brain, he could end up an idiot. Does your Li family care or not? Qianfeng, Lu Yurong, upon hearing this, turned pale with fright. The once stunningly beautiful mistress of the Lu family forgot all semblance of a forced smile and rushed over, demonstrating her cultivation level of the 15 Li realm. The daughters-in-law of the Li family usually come from martial backgrounds, with very few frail individuals. Furthermore, with countless precious medicines and secret techniques available to the Li family, even those of ordinary talent can be elevated to the 15 Li realm. Because below the celestial master realm, one can achieve ascension through resources and natural endowments. That is the early boost effect provided by the heritage of a great power. Rushing to Lin Wujing's side, Lu Yurong saw her son with chopsticks embedded in his eye socket, blood gushing out continuously, and immediately teared up from heartache, her body trembling. She wanted to touch him but dared not, as if she thought of something startling. She suddenly turned around and glared furiously at Li Hao. You bastard, he's your cousin, and you attacked him with such deadly force. Li Hao's eyes showed only regret that he hadn't managed to kill his opponent outright. Upon hearing her accusation, the corner of his mouth involuntarily curled into a sneer. Cousin? And you are supposed to be my dear second mother. Yet what have you ever done? Up front, Chen Hafeng, witnessing the sudden turn of events, went pale. Her Buddha beads, worn from years of fasting and chanting, almost snapped in her grip. The trauma of losing a son made the sight of her descendants' blood make her feel faint. Nevertheless, having managed the Li family for many years, she quickly regained her composure and spoke. The hour grows late today. Now that the true dragon of my Li family has been determined, it's best for everyone to return home. Her words were polite, but everyone knew that the old lady did not wish others to stay and gossip. This left many feeling regretful, as the grudge hidden behind the ferocity of the two juniors must be quite interesting. He Jianlan quickly stood up, coordinating the departure of the guests from the banquet. Li Tiangang's face was unsightly, but this was not the time for him to reprimand Li Hao, holding back his anger and temper. He personally escorted Jian Wudao and Chu Jiuyue out of the courtyard. Both were aware of the awkwardness the Li family faced and did not linger. They were surprised by Li Hao's ruthless actions but not overly shocked. Children of noble families often harbored grudges unknown to outsiders. Moreover, considering it involved the competition for the title of True Dragon, tension was inevitable. The previous generation had 9 sons who did not end up fighting bloody battles, mainly because Li was so outstanding and they were born of the same mother, making their relationship close. Compared to Li Hao's ferocity, they were more surprised by the formidable strength he showcased in that brief moment. It exceeded by far what they had seen of the 15 Li realm. The overwhelming power that Li Qianfeng unleashed at the critical moment could only be due to some secret technique or some external force. Given that his master is a bodhisattva, having such a trump card is not unexpected. But they did not anticipate that before it could be truly displayed, it would be crushed by Li Hao's fierce attack, almost leading to Li Qianfeng's death. The true dragon of this generation of the Li family should not be underestimated. How could that kid's swordsmanship reach such a level? How is that possible? Jian Wudao still glanced back at the young man standing in the center of the court before leaving. His shock settled, but confusion lingered in his eyes. Years ago, that child had no fascination for the sword, appearing to see it as no different from a mere twig. With such an attitude, how could he have developed such an overbearing and fierce sword intent? Quick, save my son! As the courtyard was clearing, Liu Rong urgently spoke to Lin Wujing and the old lady. Qin Hufang also knew that there was no time to waste. She quickly led the way, having Lin Wujing take Li Qianfeng to the Qinglian backyard, while ordering people to summon the family's divine healer. Chapter 140. Liu Rong followed, and upon seeing this, the rest of the ladies also went to see the extent of Li Qianfeng's injuries, knowing that saving him was of the utmost importance. After sending Jian Wudao and the others off, Li Tiangang returned to the courtyard. He strode toward Li Hao, fuming with anger. With all the guests gone, Li Tiangang glared at Li Hao and said, "I didn't discipline you, but you've gone too far." Li Hao was about to talk about the poison pill when he heard this, but instead he retorted, "Didn't you hear what that woman just called me? You." Li Tiangang flew into a rage. Of course he had heard it, but he thought it was his sister-in-law's concern for Qianfeng's life that made her speak so recklessly. "I'm going to see how Qianfeng is doing first, then I'll deal with you later." With that said, he was gone like a gust of wind, rushing over. Since his own son had injured the other party so severely, he had to go and see for himself. Otherwise, how could they continue to be relatives? Li Qijing turned back, casting a complicated look at Li Hao and said, "Hao heir, why were you so impulsive?" But Li Hao's face was already expressionless, as if in a silent trance. Upon hearing Li Qianfeng's words, a smile slowly formed on his face. "Fifth uncle. She owed me this." Li Qinzheng was momentarily stunned, looking at him questioningly. Li Hao didn't elaborate further. Instead he turned and walked toward Qinglian backyard. Given the circumstances, it was about time for the past events to be revealed. Watching Li Hao's receding back, Li Qianfeng's eyes flickered. He knew Li Hao well. After all these years of contact, he didn't care about fame and fortune at all, and truly had no reason to inflict a fatal blow just for the true dragon struggle. What could be the reason then? He took a deep breath, preparing to head to the backyard first to see Li Qianfeng's condition as well. With a flash, Li Qinzheng disappeared. In the courtyard, Li Mingguang, Li Sibei, and other third-generation members of the Li family were all looking at Li Hao in shock. Everything had changed too quickly, and they were still failing to comprehend it all. Within the crowd, Li Yuanzhao stood with his mouth agape, feeling a sense of estrangement from Hao, who he had always followed. Suddenly, Li Mingguang's figure shifted, blocking Li Hao's path. "Where are you going?" Li Mingguang's gaze was stern, his face filled with anger as he stared at Li Hao. As the oldest among the male cousins of the Li family's third generation, he was shocked and furious with Li Hao's actions. He and Li Sibei had given up the struggle for the true dragon in part because of the value they saw in their two younger cousins. Seeing his older cousin's anger, Li Hao's emotions had already retreated, and he bore no ill will toward him. On the contrary, his previous actions had made a good impression on Hao. "I'm going to see him," Li Hao said with a smile. "Stop pretending, you did it on purpose," Li Mingguang said angrily. Li Hao's smile faded slightly as he glanced at him and said, "Yes, it was intentional, you." Li Mingguang hadn't expected Li Hao to admit it so easily. His pupils shrank in anger as a terrifying air of immortality emanated from him, but he didn't act because, as the descendant of the Li family's ancestral spirit, attacking Li Hao would break his heart's oath. "I thought you had exceptional talent and even saw Uncle Nine's elegance in you, but I didn't expect you to have such a disposition. His Majesty has valued you so highly." And vainly Mingguang clenched his teeth in rage. "Do you think that just because you've won the position of the true dragon, you can act recklessly?" Li Sibei also walked over to stand by his brother, his eyes coldly fixed on Li Hao. Li Hao looked at them, fell silent for a moment, and then said, "I have my reasons. If you want to know, follow me to the backyard." "What reason could justify harming your own brother?" Li Mingguang said angrily. "Mingguang, maybe Hao has his reasons?" Li Yuanzhao tentatively came forward and said. Hearing the young boy's words, Li Hao looked at him, feeling a warmth in his heart, and he smiled at him. Seeing Li Hao smile, Li Yuanzhao instantly felt that the strange feeling had vanished. And the familiarity with Hao returned, feeling somewhat reassured. He thought he had said the right thing, so he was a bit bolder and was about to speak again when he heard Li Sibei's cold voice. "Shut up, you're too young, stay out of this." Li Yuan's mouth opened slightly, but he stammered, unable to retort. Li Wushuang and Li Yun, siblings as well, approached, their eyes filled with complex emotions as they looked at Li Hao. Li Wushuang remembered the slap Li Hao had given her on the buttocks that day, and now felt a mix of shame and anger as well as confusion. Although Li Hao had been heavy-handed that day, causing her to not dare sit down, she could feel that he was merely disciplining her without any intent to kill, which was starkly different from today. She too had offended Li Hao, but he had not intended to kill her, showing he was not a murderous person, or perhaps, as her cousin Li Mingguang had said, was it that Li Hao, having claimed victory over Li Qianfeng and secured the true dragon seat, was now revealing his violent nature? Li Yun watched Li Hao with a timid gaze, and had his elder sister not been by his side, he might have been afraid to approach. He already had a shadow of fear towards Hao in his heart, which now felt greatly magnified. What my mother said was right. His mother is from the great wilderness heaven, ferocity runs in their blood, like mother, like son. Li Jiangying and Li Ruming, siblings as well, also came over, looking disdainfully at Li Hao. Both brother and sister held a bit of jealousy towards Li Hao for claiming the title of true dragon. Li Rum felt that if only their father had let them participate earlier, it would have been more exciting, perhaps even allowing her to show off.